talk a little bit about the movement which were already mentioned, about the new volunteer movement in Russia, which were generated in the period of catastrophe, in the period of forest and pit fires in 2010, and then it had another wave in a period of catastrophe in Kursk, the flood in 2012. Over the last few years in Russia, there were some big natural calamities which excited the rapid growth of volunteer movement. The experience of civil participation in it broadened the idea of many Russian citizens about the structure of their social and political opportunities. I want to focus the attention on the structural and functional basis of the volunteer movement and consider it as a network organization involved in the basis involved on the process of the post-catastrophe rehabilitation of the residents and damaged territories, equally with the state vertical organization and in a cooperation with it. The volunteer is not a new but suddenly developed phenomenon after the forest and pit fires in summer 2010. Then thousands of ordinary citizens, using an informational resource of the internet and their own resources, material, financial, physical, and especially moral, rendered the target assistance of many of these disaster victims, extinguished fire, and took part in post-catastrophe rehabilitation of burned natural territories and settlements. As we could see in blogs, forums, and other social media, most of volunteers were residents of big cities, and they haven't had an experience of civil participation before and got it straight in the zone of emergency. Some results of this race were experience of collective action, experience of cooperation with state structures, finding of tools for mass mobilization, and accumulation of social capital. 2 years after the fires, when the flow in Krasnodar region has happened, the volunteer network were immediately mobilized and attract even more people across the country to render an urgent assistance to victims. Under civil mobilization networks, I offer to understand the networks created with using of informational and communication technologies by citizens, independent as well as the members of non-governmental organizations, for resource mobilization and informing of citizens in order to respond to a critical situation. The functions of these networks were rapid mobilization, public awareness, including the lowering of dependence from state media, coordination of the civic force activity, and collective identity feeling formation and maintenance. This network are created and developed irrespective of governmental structures, though can cooperate with them. Now I want to focus on the situation in Kursk. The flood on the night of 6 and 7 July 2012 and in Kursk and nearby settlements took away the lives of more than 170 people and destroyed more than 7,000 houses. In this situation arose a great public resonance that resulted in a long discussion about the causes of the strategy and influx of the great number of volunteers, humanitarian aid, and money from ordinary citizens in the zone of emergency. From first hours of a catastrophe, the eyewitnesses' evidence about the situation on site began to spread through the social networks, and often it hasn't coincided with messages of official media. At the time when the Emergency Control Ministry announced about the situation stabilization, and Public Health Ministry declared that in Krasnodar region there was enough resource for aiding to all victims, in the internet appeared commentaries that people needed emergency assistance, but nobody has helped them. Already the next day after the flood, volunteers expanded points of collection of humanitarian aid across the country and began to sending it to affected area. In Moscow, activists announced the observation area in front of the main building of Moscow State University as a point of collection and care. And by 10 a.m. The next day, the hashtag Смотровая, or observation, attained the top of Russian language Twitter, and information about the collection of humanitarian aid through the media and social networks spread the internet, and people began to come to observation area. The first buses with volunteers left Moscow also the next day, and after the flood. And when it came to Krimsk, as volunteers say, they were first who aided residents, though it was the third day after the disaster. As far as the first day, Emercom was equipped with a research and rescue operation, and local authorities were busy with the solution of some bureaucratic difficulties. Thereby, exactly, the volunteers undertook the functions of primary rehabilitation of residents. They opened the canteen, organized the storehouse, and it was to mention that the coming of many volunteers in the emergency zone, as in a period of forest fires, was to cause the distrust to the authorities. They say that people have many complaints to administration about the notification before the flood and about the organizations of assistance after the flood. Many also were motivated by the moral aspects. They say that their aid given understanding to victims that they are not alone. So the activists, the volunteers consider their participation as a moral debt. The territory of Krimsk and nearby settlements, there were organized several encampments, and its structure was very various position and loyal to authorities, activists, servicemen, rescues. And one can say that at first day after the flood, these camps were overpopulated. The number are different in media, but obviously that there were thousands of volunteers, from 7 to 10, and if we will mention the rotation in this period, the number could be even higher. The structure of volunteer community corresponded a network with a great number of corps in the emergency zone as well in the big cities. Such communication centrals, network corps, were the main volunteer headquarters, the leaders of camps and coordinators of volunteer aid in the big cities. Many volunteers came to Krimsk from such big cities as Moscow, St. Petersburg, Tuapse, and so on. And as I said, many of them, including even some of leaders, hadn't had such experience before. One of the factors of success in their work was exactly an interaction with professionals. Emercom and Russian Union of Rescues have taught volunteers and actively assisted them. The communication structure between the actors in the emergency zone is presented on the scheme, and thick green arrows designate the voluntary and effective interaction aimed at assistance to victims. The main assistant came from two collective actors. It's volunteer and professional rescues. The activity of Emercom were initially coordinated by regional administration, but gradually rescues became actively interact with volunteers, and because of the cadre shortage, they also begin to recruit those who desire from the population of big cities. The basic functions of the volunteers were gathering, sorting, and targeting humanitarian aid, fundraising, obtaining the feedback from residents, coordination of activities and information support of new volunteers, NGOs, and commercial organizations wishing to provide some assistance to victims. Also, it was psychological and medical aid to victims, catering for residents, debris clearing, and the repairs of damaged houses in the private sector. After providing the first emergency humanitarian aid, the duties inside the volunteer community were divided by sectors. Somebody worked on the debris clearing, somebody packaged the parcels with aid, transported it to addresses, some helped to disordered people and to the veterans of the World War, Second World War. Among the volunteers were also the professional doctors and psychologists who work with a different group of population, but also with volunteers, because for them the psychological load was too big and not all could stand with it without professional assistance. In their public diary, some volunteer mentioned that the appearance of so-called Afghan syndrome, which become apparent in such situation when people back to normal life after the emergency zone, and they begin feeling themselves uncomfortably. The values of peaceful life lost its significance for them. Except the psychological load, volunteers community faced another problem, became actual in the age of high technologies. As in every social movement in volunteer community appeared so-called free riders. And in Krymsk came many of day-off volunteers, the main motivation of which was not an assistance to victims, but the presence in the thick of things, and the possibility to inform their acquaintance about presence in the zone of emergency through the social media and Facebook and Twitter and so on. The presence of these people deeply hampered the work of real volunteers for who the strict discipline and dedication were guarantee of success, and at the same time was the moral code. There were also different problems that bothered the work of volunteers camp. Particularly, it was a disagreement with local authorities and their wish to control the activity of volunteers. Some weeks after volunteers coming to Krymsk, the local authorities offered them to shift their camps from the center of a town a few kilometers away, which would greatly bother the aiding to residents. Also, the beginning of July has happened another event connected with the development of volunteer movement in Russia. There was offered a bill about the activity of volunteers, which officially was directed to an effective growth of social-oriented organizations, but in fact become another bureaucratic obstacle to its implementation. Nevertheless, the public attitudes toward volunteers were characterized by high level of trust and appreciation. I want to show you some evidence which were coping by the specialists of St. Petersburg School of Economics, managed by Professor Kostyshev. And you can see that the trust to volunteer among the residents was approximately the same level as the trust to neighbors and relatives in that period. The Emercom also has a quite level of trust in comparison with federal power, and all the more so the municipal officials. As a resume, I could say that socio-ecological disasters that happened during the last 3 years across the country initiated substantial changes in Russian civil society. Firstly, the new civic groups of communities, though being relatively young, acted as efficient network organization which are capable to render help to the affected residents. Secondly, being not well known when they work as volunteers, they gained the residents' trust. And thirdly, the experience of volunteers in the rescue operations is widened their comprehension concerning their political and social opportunity structure. I should mention also that during these 3 years, we could observe the rise of civil initiative across the country in various spheres, and what about the trust to volunteer community. It proved even in different spheres, not about rescues, not about such situation as in Krimsk and in Central Russia after fires, but even a serious interview with zoo defenders, which I conducted in this September, showed that even in this sphere, people mentioned the rise of supporters last 2 years or 3, and in last 2 or 3 years, and growth of trust to them from the population. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Olga. Any questions? Ilya Matveev.
I have a question about the interaction between volunteers and the local population. The thing that interested me very much in this whole situation with Krimsk, and the volunteer effort during the disasters in Russia is that in America, for example, community groups organize residents to help themselves during these times, right? And it seems to me that in Krimsk and in Russian cases, volunteers they organize among themselves, but they do not organize the local population. And as I read in some reports, it even created some tension, because the volunteers just came and helped local citizens, but those citizens could help themselves, but they just relied on volunteers in their efforts. They said, okay, they'll do it. And I think that's a crucial point that, for example, during the Katrina relief efforts in New Orleans, organizations like ACOR, they organized New Orleans population to help themselves. And after the event, the local population fought for their housing rights and school rights and everything after the rebuilding. So because they were already organized. And here volunteers came, they helped like a charity, right? And Aleshkovsky, who led the volunteer effort at Kurs, he is now a leader of a charity group. So volunteer effort is like charity in Russia. But in America, it's more like organizing. It's organizing people to help themselves. Do you think that this contrast is correct, and I'm correct in saying that, or is this evidence of other things?
Thank you for the question. I think you're right. And if it's possible, I want to mention not about the situation in Krimsk, but the situation about after fires. I have some in-depth, 3 years after fires, I have in-depth interviews with victims of these fires, people who lost their houses in local settlements in Moscow region and in Ryazan region. And as I see, yes, you're right, volunteers render this help by themselves. People were lost at this period. They were in their sorrow, they don't know what to do, and so on. And they were very, there were many bureaucratic processes that they should do in this period. They write many documents about new houses, about receiving an aid, and they don't do anything to help themselves. But and when the volunteer community emerged in Russia, we could say about the solidarity community creativity. In a local territories begin the process of disintegration of community, because in burnt settlements, people, it's villages, it's not big cities. People in these territories are more, have more solidarity in the community than the big cities. And after the fires, people lost their common environment, and they lost their these ties, which were integrate them in a community. So two parallel processes begin after this.
So, you mentioned the contrast between Russia and the United States, but I think one common feature between the two countries is that these volunteer efforts are a response to a typical neoliberal situation where the state has withdrawn from earlier methods of disaster response. So if you compare what happened in New Orleans in terms of the late arrival of FEMA and instead the arrival of Blackwater, which is a private militarized company that was sent there without a congressional mandate, right? That's a very, very different situation from the sort of classic response in, let's say, New Deal America, when tens of thousands of jobless, homeless men were mobilized for disaster response, among other things. And in a sense, the situation in the Soviet Union and Russia is not that different. So what we had in the Soviet Union was a state-orchestrated disaster response system. Machiavelli in Paris is writing a book about that right now. Which had an extreme distrust of local citizen initiative. So I'm now working on Soviet war memorials, and I found something very interesting in an archive in Minsk recently, where in 1946, people in one of the western regions of Belarus are collecting money voluntarily to rebury all the corpses that are still strewn about. And they get a response from Minsk saying, according to directive such and such from the Central Committee from 1938 or 1939, any volunteer collection of funds is prohibited without express permission from Moscow. Right? So that's just one example. And what happens, and you can see this very clearly if you compare Russia with Belarus today. One of the reasons why there's such a massive volunteer movement in Russia is that the state has very largely withdrawn from disaster response, even the way it used to function under some of the first organizations created by Shoigu. Right? So I think that's a very important point. We shouldn't just look at all the sort of the mobilizing experience and the interaction between the volunteers, the state, and the local population, but we should also keep the sort of general structural problem in mind. It's the whole reason why we're seeing this movement, which we all perceive as very positive and energizing, etc., is that the state essentially has abandoned one of its main functions. So I was wondering, if there's anything in your research that can tell us more about that.
Yes, maybe you're right, if I understand the question, that volunteers try to replace the state debts to render an aid to victims. And as I said, this distrust to state power and state services was the main motivation of volunteers to take part in this volunteer movement.
Okay. Yes.
Just a brief comment to this discussion between we had research about the fires and the impact of the Russian fires on the attitudes towards governments and towards the structural powers, and we had slightly different results because, of course, we do not need to mix a very general problem of distrust of the state praise the authorities with the problem of state reaction to the fires or wars or something like that. Because so-called emergency structures were absolutely effective. They were really working very good. I mean, NGS structures and all. In case of fires, for instance, in case of floods, sometimes. But then there was problems, for example, with compensations, with financial compensations to people who were victims who were somehow touched by the fires or by the floors. So the problem here was, of course, about withdrawal. I really feel like police withdrawal overall government from our political system, but still the very people as a street level sometimes really were very effective. So we need to be very careful in distinguishing these two things. And after the fires, the very attitude towards government became much more trusting. So people who were touched by the fires started to trust the government more than before, and they started opposing more than before, because they felt themselves like that the government cares them. You see, so that's a very, very complicated question, and I really want you to be very specific in this attitudes towards government, volunteers, all civil society structures. It's very important.
Yeah, thank you. I think you're right, but it connected with situation because in Nizhny Novgorod, for example, the Ministry of Natural Resources, the servicemen of this ministry struggle with fires together with volunteers. But for example, in Moscow region in Beloomut, Emercom stay and look at fires in a forest because they can't, in this instruction, they can't to struggle the fires if it's not on a territory of settlements. So only volunteers and forestry servicemen could struggle with fires, but we know in 2007 the forestry services were cut really, and in forests the forestry services were retired, thousands of these people, so they have no any aid to.
Yes, Karin.
Tell us a little bit more about the relationship between local population and volunteers. For example, I'm interested in such a question. The volunteers which went to help the local population, how was their attitude to the local population? Is there any kind of sense of superiority, but we are better educated, more autonomous and something like that?
Thank you. I don't think that it was such an attitude to residents, but as I could see in my interviews with victims after fires, the victims don't mention a lot about the aid of volunteers because they, in this period, they were absolutely lost, and they say yes, there was much aid from volunteers, from Единая Россия, from everyone. But they mention most of all, President Putin and Единая Россия because they build them houses. They absolutely look at only about on the power structures.
How the volunteers talk about that?
Volunteers were cooperate with them in the periods of fires, for example, and in on the periods of flood in Krimsk, they also don't being like teachers for victims. They I'm sorry, I forget the English words.
Say it in Russian. Do you remember Russian word?
Yes, sorry. So. Okay. К сожалению, у меня нету вот такой эмпирической базы интервью с волонтерами, которые действовали в Крымске, но по тем материалам, которые есть в интернете, по их публичным дневникам, видно, что они, скажем так, не были теми людьми, которые считали пострадавших низшим как бы сословием. Для них.
There was no idea that the victims were lower in class and status.
Okay.
It was absent. Okay. Well, thank you, Olga.